Well, welcome to 180 Days Education, a podcast about all things education, though we do tend to focus on mathematics and science and lots of different things somehow connected to teaching and pedagogy and learning. So we're excited that you're joining us. This is our first episode in season 3, which is thrilling for Tim and I. I'm Karen Greenhouse, one of your hosts.
And I'm Tim Pope,
the other host. And we are joining you from different places. I'm in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia.
And I am in the beautiful city of Bogota, Colombia, teaching at an international school down here for year number 2. Woo!
So in this first episode of our season 3, we are excited to be having Jim Ryan, who is the executive director of OpenSciEd, which is a online web-based free curriculum for science, and it aligns to the next generation science standards. And so Jim's going to be sharing with us, how that came about and what's the purpose and what's the need for this. And he's going to be talking about the curriculum and the struggles and the successes. So really interesting, especially if you are a leader looking for science curriculum. This is something you definitely want to be listening to. But before we begin, we have a couple changes. Those of you who've been following us for the last couple of years, we're kind of switching things up in season 3. So Tim's going to kind of tell you some of the things that we've decided to add to kind of make it a little more exciting.
Both people that have been listening are going to be filled in, and they're going to know what's going on. All right. We've added a couple things. The first one, which we'll set out here in a second, is a segment to let Karen and I just discuss a bit about what we see going on in the world of education, both from the a teacher-educator perspective that Karen brings, and I as a classroom teacher, and both of us as parents. And we're going to do it under the guise of Notice and Wonder. It's become a very successful and popular tool used in classrooms to help introduce students to new concepts and get students to share their thinking and share their wisdom. And so we're going to adopt that, and we're going to begin every episode talking just a bit about what we notice and wonder about what's going on in the world of education. So that'll be first, and then we'll have the interview like we've been doing. And then we've added something to the end of each interview called What Crushes Us and What Inspires Us. And we're going to ask our guests to share from their experience what has sort of crushed them or challenged them professionally recently, and then also what's inspired them to leave with some amount of hope and inspiration around the work that we're all doing together. And then Karen and I will chime in as we have interesting, relevant things to crush and inspire.
Hopefully more inspire, but sometimes it's crushing. Yeah.
I don't know, like Karen led on, we've already done a couple of these, and I think the ones I've had have always been, it's almost the same thing. It started crushing, but then it became inspiring at the end. So there we go.
True. Well, I think educators in general tend to be looking for the silver lining in everything.
A little commiseration and a little inspiration is what we're hoping to provide.
Exactly. So why don't we actually just get started with our first Notice and Wonder, and then we'll go right into our interview with Jim Ryan from OpenSciEd. So here's what I've noticed ever since COVID. Obviously, education was kind of put online for everybody. And so I noticed parents becoming much more involved than I'd ever seen it before in education, which is good and bad. So I wonder, now that we're back into the schools, if that is going to continue. And if it is that a good thing or a bad thing? So that's my noticing and my wondering is, what is the level of parent involvement that's going to go forth as we transition back into face-to-face?
And that's a great notice and wonder, because I have felt that way. I mean, yes, I agree with you. COVID definitely seems to have accelerated the involvement. But at what point, I mean, it's just a constant question for me around, so yes, parents have every right and should be involved in their kids' education. But at some point, I mean, educators have been trained, like we know what we're doing. So like, where's that ground where we're respecting and honoring the perspective of parents, yet at the same time respecting and honoring the training and professionalism of the educators? And when those lock horns, I mean, to me, it's just it's a tough question. And I think with the whole, I mean, right now it's become very political around the mask mandates and the I mean, I don't know. Texas is my still permanent American home, so I keep up on what's going on there, and they're like the whole what books are in the libraries and all that stuff. So it seems to have become really political, and which is unfortunate to me because like I think we're getting away from the fundamental question. Like, all right, yeah, I mean, I am a father, and I still have one kid in school, and I definitely want to have a voice in her education and how she's being educated. Yet I still want to honor the fact that she has a group of professional qualified teachers that know what they're doing. And like, what's that? Yeah, it's a tough one. That's great. That's a great notice and wonder.
Thank you. And maybe that'll be an episode. Who knows? So what's your notice and wonder before we get to Jim?
I'm noticing in terms of my own practice, like talk about COVID and how COVID has influenced what is now my regular practice, the things that I did in COVID, that actually the silver lining in the cloud. Like for example, so I do teach at a school where they keep track of how many pages we print using the school printer, and we're allowed 2,000 pages a year, which that's not photocopies, that's just printing. Then you can use the photocopier, and that's a whole nother deal. And we are now in mid-November, so we started school in mid-August, and I have 1,996 print pages still on my account. And I used 3 of those to print one of my daughter's papers for her at school. So my point being is that I've noticed that I've become, and now I'm at a school where kids have their own machines, and have really embraced using tools. Specifically, I love Greenhouse and I love Casio, but I've become quite enamored with the Activity Builder in Desmos, and I build all my lessons in it every day. And it's become my go-to tool. And I just wonder, how has COVID influenced pedagogically how we instruct? Like, I know technology has obviously become a bigger deal, my example, and I'm sure others have their examples as well. And is that a good thing? Ed tech is usually considered this progressive, like, okay, we're making education better. We're integrating technology. And my wondering is, okay, is that a good thing that I'm doing it that way? Like, is it a good thing that my students have had very limited interactions with a pencil and a piece of paper this school year?
I think that's a great noticing. And actually, I do think this, so maybe that's what we use this whole section for, is we come up with these notice and wonderings, and that leads to another episode. And we have to find the people. So if you're listening and you have a possible answering to our wondering, get on our website and say, hey, I want to be on, and we'll invite you on. But let's move right into Jim, because I think we've rambled on long enough. So let's get into Jim. I am so excited today for our guest, Jim Ryan, who is the executive director of, and I want to make sure I say this right, OpenSciEd.
Hooray! Yes.
He is an old friend from both long ago, from Tim and I, from our key days. And I just feel like I haven't connected with him in years. So I'm excited just to even hear his voice again. But we are excited for him to join us and talk about OpenSciEd. So welcome, Jim. We are thrilled to have you.
Thanks. Great to have a conversation with you guys again. It's been too long.
I'm intimidated having my former boss as a guest.
Both our former bosses. Yeah, that is correct.
There may be a performance review coming after this.
You guys spent more time telling me what to do than I ever spent telling you guys what to do.
True enough.
I'm not admitting to that.
I just remember a conversation I had with Tim where he said, I know what you want me to do. I just don't want to do it. And so
I do remember that conversation.
Oh, dear. Okay, so let's move on to where you are now, shall we? My goodness. So I guess the obvious first question is, what is OpenSciEd? And if I'm saying it wrong, please correct me. And how did you end up here? Because I know that you did a lot of things before you got to key curriculum, and then you did a lot of things after key curriculum. So how did you end up in this situation? What is it, and how did you get here?
Yeah, so OpenSciEd is an effort that brings together state departments of ed from 10 partner states, a group of world-class curriculum developers, and philanthropic organizations to create a next generation science standards aligned K through 12 curriculum. And I've been with them for 3 years, and the project started almost a year before that, almost like a proof of concept. And it started as simply because the next generation science standards were adopted in 2012, 2013 by many, many states, and states that comprise over 75% of the students in the country. And there was an assumption is if you could get a critical mass of states to adopt these new standards that are three-dimensional and ask for us to redefine what counts as science instruction, that the publishers would respond by creating products that align to those. But at the same time, those, for a variety of reasons, the publishing industry consolidation, the rolling out of the Common Core standards, the publishers primarily kept their research and development dollars in ELA and math. And so as these states started to wait around, there was this frustration that wait a minute, we're now getting ready to implement assessments associated with the standards, and we haven't been able to provide anything for our teachers to actually instruct using these new standards. And so these 10 states gathered, and it's a diverse set of states. It's you've got places like Massachusetts, Washington, and California, but there's also states like Iowa, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. So it's not a red, blue. It's a wide swath of our country, representative swath of our country, saying if we all adopted standards that are similar or aligned to or inspired by the next generation science standards, can we agree upon things like scope and sequence, instructional models, the specifications of what assessment should look like, what classroom culture should look like? If we can agree on those kinds of things, are developers willing to develop to those? And is philanthropy then willing to fund the development of that? And so OpenSciEd became from that original proof of concept has now become a product and an organization. We are going to develop K through 12, but you had to start someplace. And so we started in middle grades. We will have a full middle grades program completed by February of 2022, just in a few months. We have already started on the high school materials, and those are being field tested right now in hundreds of classrooms with thousands of students. And we're fundraising for K through 5 science materials. And we're really encouraged by the way that teachers have already responded to these materials, because as we develop the materials on a unit by unit basis, we release them in these units, 4 to 6 weeks of instruction. And of the roughly 70,000 middle grade science teachers across the country, we have 30,000 of them already registered with us and taking a look at these materials. And some are using them. Some districts have already adopted. We don't even have a full program yet. So the idea that the market was ready for next generation science standards aligned materials was the right guess, and making them Creative Commons, making them an open education resource, allowing teachers and school districts to adapt them for their context is the right way to approach this work. So that's roughly what OpenSciEd is, but we are also supporting the materials as with professional learning, as well as building partnerships with others, so that as schools and districts adopt these materials, they don't need to call upon somebody to fly across the country to support their teachers with professional learning. They can call up a county office or a local trusted nonprofit that already does professional learning for them.
All right. So just to clarify, Open Ed means they're free to districts and teachers, right? And so that's what the funders are doing, is making sure that all of these products remain free. Is that a forever thing, you think?
Yeah, so we release them with a license called Creative Commons. It's called CC BY 4.0, and we release them as downloadable PDFs, Google Docs, and soon to be LMS cartridges. So they are freely downloadable. So you can go ahead and take them and put them on your Google Drive and then adapt them for your context. For instance, we're already working with other states that have said we have a different sequence of courses in middle grades. Can we change them? And we're like, of course, and we can help you do that. They aren't so precious that there is only one way of going through them. So they are freely available, and they are not locked in some fashion where we think that they're so precious that they can't be changed.
And let's just clarify when you mean by what they are. What are the materials? Are we talking student materials, teacher materials, assessments? Like there's all the stuff that traditionally a teacher gets when they adopt a curriculum. So what's included in those free materials?
Yeah, so there are the classroom materials, which is a student edition, a teacher guide, all the slides and handouts you would want, and we provide those in digital form. Or if you want them as a print form, we have a agreement to have them printed inexpensively for schools and districts. And then we also have, with every single one of these units, the 4 to 6 weeks of instruction, we have multiple days of content for professional learning. So all the protocols, the agendas, the handouts, the videos that you would use in a professional learning setting, that's for teachers. And we also have it available. So if you want to train up a team of facilitators to support your teachers in implementing these materials, we have those as well. So it's the idea that if we're asking teachers to teach in a way that is significantly different than the previous way they've approached science instruction, we need to give them support to do so. And part of that idea around the support is the professional learning content to work through. And another part of that that idea is that if we can make these materials as inexpensive as possible to purchase, the hope and the belief is that schools and districts can then redirect some of those instructional materials funds and direct them towards professional learning to support your teachers and implementing them.
Which research has shown is one of the keys to making a sustainable change in instruction is supporting your teachers. So that makes sense.
Yeah, and harkening back on whether our key days are in your current roles and in my current role, we know that professional learning not associated with a curriculum or content becomes frustrating for teachers. If you learn how to teach with deep, rich problems for students to do, but you're stuck with a very traditional old curriculum, it's like hitting your head at the bottom of a very shallow pool. There just isn't any depth to it. And yet, at the same time, if you're giving somebody a really deep, rich curriculum that, for us, asks the students to conduct themselves as scientists, to ask questions and hypothesize, and then investigate their own questions to develop their understanding, and you haven't supported teachers on how to support the students in it and answering the questions they ask themselves versus students answering the questions that the teachers pose, you're not setting a teacher up for success either.
So I'm going to ask a question that feel free to say, yeah, you've gone outside of the bounds of my expertise. I don't want to talk about it. But you said you guys are field testing high school right now. And I know at my school, there is a usually polite debate going on within our high school science department around NGSS, with half the teachers believing it's the best thing to happen to science education, and the other half believing the opposite, specifically that you can't teach NGSS and prepare kids for AP science.
Boy, it sounds like a Common Core argument, right?
It does. And so Jim, I don't know if you've already been in your conversations with potential high school partners have had this conversation to be able to speak to it or not. But if you can, I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I don't believe that. And in the same way, I don't believe it for Common Core. If we ask students in a science classroom, our materials are designed so that you start off with this driving with a phenomena as the NGS has asked for, where students are presented with a scientific context and phenomena, and then asked to notice and wonder about that phenomena. What do they know? What do they not know? What do they assume? What do they want to learn about? And from that, they develop a driving question board. And It is those students' questions that then drive through the storyline of the unit towards the target standards. Now, that is asking of somebody much deeper cognitive skills or deeper learning skills than any fact and vocabulary based science materials, which the AP as well as other materials are, I would argue, are primarily oriented towards. And so if we're asking students to do something that is frankly much more intellectually robust, I don't see how that habit of mind is going to restrain them in any way from future study. I would say the opposite is true, that it can propel them. And so, if we are successful, we'll desettle the current system in which those students that find affection for and find success in science, particularly in AP, are those with the preparatory privilege of, a parent who's an engineer or went to science camp in middle school, or have somebody who has helped them along the way, so that they actually had some introduction to materials before the class did.
So my thoughts are your argument to me is the argument that we had for Common Core. To me, it's a very similar mindset, on both sides. So do you think that the lessons learned from Common Core are helping maybe change how you introduce this curriculum, or just knowing how Common Core has become such a political hotbed to try to avoid that? Are you guys doing different things to make sure that that does not happen?
Yeah, and I was right in the midst of the Common Core math arguments with you all at the time, and now the science piece. So I would say that there's a couple distinctions that are useful in this. One is when most people argued against the Common Core, it was less about the content of the Common Core as it was about states feeling that they were compelled to take them on when they didn't really understand them or know them, because they came about during the economic downturn, and then Race to the Top funds essentially put the onus saying, if you want these funds, these competitive funds, you need to adopt the Common Core standards. And so they were compelled to adopt them without giving it much thought. Well, that kind of pressure and financial incentive to adopt them, that then states started to question as to whether they really wanted to do it, never happened in science. So we don't have those same kind of sense that states had to adopt it just to be able to stay afloat financially. So that's helpful in this context. And so because of that, the states that have adopted it are adopting them in a variety of ways, not as prescribed as the Common Core ended up being. So there's that piece that is helping us. The piece that will likely get in the way is the science arguments around politically fraught topics like climate change. And will every state want materials that accept climate change as something students need to learn about and understand?
So a sort of related question. Another reason the Common Core also caused so many problems is because it was a major shift for so many teachers in their instructional strategies, right? So the traditional, lecture and students memorizing, they were being asked in the Common Core to do more problem solving, conceptual understanding. Do you feel like that's as much of an adjustment for teachers? I'm thinking in science, where they're already doing experiments and stuff, that it's going to be less of a change in their mind on what they have to do with these standards.
Yeah, I mean, the shift is equally as great and equally as hard, as we all know. I mean, and then schools don't always do a great job at supporting teachers in doing so. As former teachers, we all know that, the first time you try something new, it doesn't go well. And it may not go well the second or third time as well. And so the easiest thing is to retrench back to the old ways of doing business. And so if that happens, if we don't take this seriously as to how we are going to support teachers in changing the approach to teaching in the classroom, yes, there will be tremendous struggles. And then the other piece of this, and this relates to both Common Core and next generation science standards, is that there's a lot of wisdom in our teacher core, and they have taught in a certain way because they believed it was the best approach. If you're asking them to walk back from that belief system, we have to be confident that we're giving them something that is actually going to work better. And we have to acknowledge the strengths and the wisdom that they come with. And so, that's part of providing the materials in an editable format, is saying, this is the way we wrote them, and this is what we learned in our field test, and this is the way that we're releasing them. But you're a teacher in your own classroom. Make the changes you need to make them your own and make them sing in your classroom. I have a adage that I use, that what teachers really want is a curriculum that they own, not one that's purchased for them. We're trying to make it so that teachers themselves bring their own voice to the materials.
So I have two different tracks I want to go down. So I'm going to pick one that's most closely related to what you're talking about, which is, you've shared what you're doing with OpenSciEd and how it's really another step toward changing the paradigm of how schools adopt and implement instructional materials. I want you to go back in your Wayback Machine and talk about San Francisco as well. Because, honestly, you took some huge steps in that direction in your work with the team at San Francisco Unified as well. So I was wondering if you would share a bit about, briefly, what you did there and how you see that as really continuing this evolution of providing the best instructional materials for teachers and students.
So prior to being at OpenSciEd, I was the STEM executive director in San Francisco. And the work in San Francisco, I'll talk about the math work because I think that's what most people are aware of and what you're relating to. But we did something very similar in science too. And then we also implemented a computer science for all initiative there. And so in San Francisco, they knew that they had to implement the Common Core standard. And then when they looked at materials, they weren't aligned. When they looked at the classrooms and the current practices, they weren't aligned. And not only that, but as a district, it felt at times like it was 135 island nations. And so it was a loose confederacy rather than a unified district. And so my work was to try and find some coherence in what we were doing so that we could move the district as a whole forward in our math instruction. And so, and part of this was thinking about, as a central office person, what are all the levers you have to create change? And so, we have our hands on a lever that's called curriculum. We have our hands on another lever that's called professional learning. We have our hands on another lever that's called policy. And we recognize that to create the change we wanted to, we couldn't rely on just one lever. It couldn't just be professional learning and not change either policy or curriculum. We couldn't just change a curriculum and change what we wanted to without doing the professional learning and the policy pieces. And so we embarked upon the work with all of it somewhat simultaneously, but there's thoughtful work in what is the right sequence and in what is the right intensity to all of that. And so on the professional learning side, we did a lot of work with our teachers around not only what do the standards look like and how are these standards different than our current practice and why do we want to make this change, but we also did a lot of work on thinking about equity in our classrooms and what are students coming into the classroom with and how do we value all students' voice in that classroom and mitigate for things that get in the way, like status that students bring into in the classroom associated with gender, special needs, ethnicity. So we did a lot of professional learning on that side. We also, at the same time, started looking at our current policies around who was going into what classes in math and who was finding success and affection for math. And that's where we looked at how we place students in classes as early as middle school, and we detracked our math system through early high school. But then the other piece of that was none of those things are going to work if the curriculum, as I mentioned earlier, if the curriculum is terribly traditional and not rich enough to elicit student voices and to elicit different ways of knowing and different ways of solving. And so there we recognized that we actually had to construct our own curriculum and do so in such a way that what we valued was a rich problem. Students doing the math in multiple ways and understanding one another's thinking and being able to explain not only your own thinking but that of your peers. And so we did that over a period of years. The biggest thing a couple of things that we learned in having that kind of fluid construction of a curriculum was, one is that there's this synchronicity between teachers getting better and the curriculum getting better. Is that our commitment was, as we assemble this curriculum as a team of teachers from all of our different schools, you will give us feedback and we will revise it every year to make it better. And what we found was that teachers would give us feedback saying this wasn't rich enough, this didn't elicit enough of the student voice. And so as they got more discriminating, the curriculum got better and better and better over a period of four or 5 years. And the other side of this was it gave us an opportunity to support community conversations where historically teachers can become a group of independent contractors. So they close their door, they do what they do. Across the hallway, the person is doing what they do, and it may or may not cohere at all. And what you wanted to do was you wanted to think about not your unit of change in the district as the individual teacher, but more as the school site in that department of teachers that will gather and therefore not keep their ideas to themselves, but put them at the center of the table and say, what do you guys think of this? How do we make this better? How do we help students understand that and start to collaborate around that work so that we as a community of teachers in a school make not only commitments to our students, but commitments to one another as teachers. We saw substantial growth in the district over those periods of years, but it wasn't just a curriculum change. It was in supporting a change in the classroom, you need to apply all the levers that are available to you.
I mean, I agree with everything you said. I did want to go back. Could you clarify what you meant by detracking?
I was gonna say, you notice how he dropped it in? Like we took out the trash, we fed the dog, and we totally revolutionized how we do high school courses.
I know what it is, but I know a lot of people are not, and it's also a very political hot issue, right?
So. Yeah, it is. It is, and so tracking is a practice that is prevalent across the United States in math education. Well, all course levels, but math education predominantly, in which some point, usually pretty early in a student's education, there's a decision of which students can be moved ahead into accelerated courses and which ones would not be put into accelerated courses. Many times that happens in elementary school. In San Francisco, it happened in middle school. And when you put those students into those accelerated or non-accelerated courses, you are determining whether they will go to essentially calculus or not in high school. If you don't get put into those things, to that accelerated track, calculus in high school becomes almost impossible. And so we looked at it and recognized that was happening when the student was like 12 years old, way too nascent in a student's educational career. So essentially what was happening were the students who, as I mentioned earlier, have this preparatory privilege for whatever reason, get moved ahead, and those without it don't. San Francisco had, when that was done, found that if you were white or Asian, you had roughly a 50-50 chance of getting put into the accelerated courses. And if you were Black or Latinx, you had a roughly 80% of not going into the accelerated courses, 20% chance of going. And we were like, well, that's not right. And so the next policy was saying, okay, everybody's going to take Algebra 1 in 8th grade. And so everybody gets into the accelerated courses, which essentially meant that you were skipping material to get into the Algebra 1 courses. And we found that 50% of our students were having to retake Algebra 1 from 8th grade and then taking it again in 9th grade. And what was happening there is you're essentially telling a student when they're repeating that you simply aren't all that good at math. You know, we tried to teach it to you in 8th grade. It didn't work. So we're going to try and teach you the same material in 9th grade. So there is a message that we, as a school system, we send to a student when we do that. And so what we did when we detracked was we said, okay, every student should have a choice as to whether to accelerate or not. But that acceleration should be made when they're a bit more mature and have a good feel for whether they want to work harder to cover more material more quickly. And it should be up to them. It's not up to the adults in the system only to do that. So what we did was we said after everybody goes through middle grades Common Core math, which in 8th grade is roughly half of Algebra 1 already. And then you take in 9th grade, everybody takes an Algebra 1 course, and then you take a geometry course. And after the geometry course, you make a decision as to whether you want to go to calculus or not. And we designed a 2-year sequence that would allow you to get to calculus or get into an AP course. So that's what we passed, and that's what we supported teachers in doing. And so that's an example of if you are going to make that difference in that classroom. So now every teacher is looking at a much more heterogeneous group of students versus the segregated students that we had before. You need a different curriculum, you need different pedagogies, and you need to approach your classroom differently. And so that's what we did.
But it's done really well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like we talked to Lizzie. And this is Lizzie Hull Barnes. For those of you who don't know who we're talking about, we'll include a link to her.
Yeah, shout out to Lizzie. She made the New York Times again last week.
Yeah, so you know she's still there and she's doing an amazing job, and she has the data. But the first piece that we looked at that gave us real encouragement was that the student a graduating class went from roughly 40 or 50% of their students retaking Algebra 1 down to 8% of the graduating classes retaking a math course. We were seeing that the number of students in AP courses was much more diverse than it was before. We saw, and this relates to science, that there were more Black and Latinx students taking a 3rd year of science than previous to the policy. Now, that might be because they have more room in their schedule because they're not repeating courses. It might be that you know, as we always talk about how science and math are interrelated, that if we're no longer sending them the message that they're not very good at math, that they choose to continue to pursue more science too. So it's a success. It continues to be a political fight because there are powerful folks who really liked the old system.
I don't know how the political naysayers, like, how can they argue with the results that are clearly showing what an impact that it's had in math? I mean, did it have the same impact? You just said it had it in science, that there's more in science. So that's exciting.
Yeah. It's been nearly 4 years now since I was at the district. So I haven't looked at the recent data whether the work in science is continued to have the same impact. And, let's also be honest, the pandemic over the past couple of years will have an impact on your data too. So there's substantial noise in the system to be able to make conclusions moving forward.
And if I recall correctly, I know one of the distinct things that the early data was showing, I mean, I haven't talked to Lizzie since before the pandemic, but was there's been a significant increase in students, not just necessarily in AP Calculus, but in statistics, which we could do a whole nother episode on about the value of statistics in data education, and why that might actually be a more significant finding than traditionalists or the way we traditionally look at math education may hold.
Yeah. A big part of, as we ask students to answer their own questions about science, is actually being able to interpret data. And so students being data literate is absolutely a key to success in science courses.
You said for OpenSciEd, you guys are doing middle school, or you've done middle school, and it's been out for a while. You're piloting high school. You didn't talk anything about elementary school. Like, why not elementary? What are the challenges in elementary science education? Why did you guys decide to go the way you went in terms of developing materials?
We are an effort to develop K through 12 science. And so we are committed to that. But you have to start someplace. Not only because you have a certain number of developers that you can do that, but there's only so much money that you can raise at one time for the development, or that we've been successful in raising. So we started at middle grades for some obvious reasons for those of us who are in the education space, is that in high school, there was less immediate buy-in because they were grade banded, the standards. They didn't say you're going to teach it as a freshman course, a sophomore course, and a junior course of science, or biology, chemistry, physics. And so there was considerable debate on whether we do an integrated or a typical sequence of life, chemistry, and physics. And so we wanted to allow the market to have that debate before we started to develop materials. At the K through 5 space, the tragedy of science education, or STEM education generally, is that science doesn't get adequate time at the K through 5 space. It generally gets about 20 minutes a day on average, compared to roughly 3 hours for ELA and 60 minutes for math. And it's simply inadequate to cover the standards and give students the feel and the love for science that we all want them to have. And so we wanted that. We knew we needed to take on K through 5, and we knew we needed to be an advocate for that. But that also pushed us towards, let's get started now and let's do it in middle school, because we know there's dedicated science specialists in that space. There's dedicated time, and there isn't as much tension as to what the courses will be. And so that's why we started in middle. The next tranche of work was, we decided, what do we go, K through 5 or high school? And it was simply that we work with state partners, and those state partners were saying our high school teachers don't have anything to work with on NGSS related materials. And so we took that on, and we chose to go with, after doing a full market analysis, to, at least in this first effort, to make it a biology, chemistry, physics course with the earth and space science standards threaded through those 3 courses. We will take on K through 5. We're raising money now. We're hoping to get started on that in the first half of 2022. And we're also hoping that, there was a recent release of a report by the Board on Science Education that really speaks to the tragedy that is K through 5 science currently, and prompting folks to take it on. What are the things that will move the needle on this? And so we're hoping that report gains traction among our practitioners and researchers to become strong advocates for time spent on K through 5 science.
That's kind of depressing to hear how the state of science is in elementary.
Where it actually gets a bit more depressing is the fact that when you look at who are the students who actually receive science, and generally if you are in a school that already tests well in ELA and math. So I live in the Bay Area. So wealthier communities like Palo Alto, where Stanford is, those students test well in ELA and math. And so there isn't the pressure on the teacher to up those scores. Therefore, they will dedicate the time to science. Where if you go to schools where the students don't test well in ELA and math, then there is external pressure on those teachers to spend more time on those subjects. Well, where does it come out of? It comes out of science. And when we look at it with an ethnic breakdown, it is again our Black and Latinx students who are being shortchanged science in K through 5 because the ELA and math test scores are driving where the teachers need to spend their time.
Well, I asked you the question because I sort of wanted you to go down that road. I mean, it's a significant issue for all the reasons you said. I mean, starting with No Child Left Behind, the whole, all right, students have to be able to fully read and comprehend by third grade so they can take a test, became the focal point, not only in terms of time, but then in terms of resources dedicated for materials and all the other challenges that come with that.
It's sort of almost a nice segue into our crush and
there you go. Yes.
Right? So Tim and I, in this new season, are ending each episode by asking our guests, and then we also will do the same thing, to give us one thing in Tim, you word this better than I do.
Something in your recent professional past that has sort of crushed your spirit, and then to end on a positive note, something in your recent past that has inspired your work and inspired you.
I'm laboring over the crushed spirit piece, so it's not that there aren't uplifting moments. So there's a couple things I would say. That the crushing the spirit is likely what we just talked about. Is we have identified, the Board on Science Education just wrote a report on the idea that by limiting the exposure to science education among the students who have historically been the furthest away from STEM opportunities generally, we are setting ourselves up to duplicate exactly what we have now, where, we have a populace whose scientific literacy as a whole is inadequate to deal with big problems like pandemics and climate change. And one in which the scientists who are charged with taking the tip of the spear on solving those problems are not diverse enough to make good decisions for our entire community. So it's less a crushing of my spirit, as more of a recognition that we aren't making progress in this near as fast as we need to. That would be the thing that I struggle with more than anything else in terms of science education. The thing that truly uplifts me is thinking about, a few things that truly uplifts me is that, one of the things that we struggled with was we had these innovative, high quality materials that only got used by 3 to 5% of the market, which is a traditional NSF.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, exactly. which is a typical NSF type curriculum. And so here with OpenSciEd, we have innovative, high quality materials, and we aren't even done with the middle school. And over 40% of the middle school teaching market has been interested enough to inspect them, to register with us, to dabble in them, to start thinking about it. And it's not just because they're free, because a lot of things are free. So the whole idea that maybe we can actually, historically, you either put out these high quality, innovative materials and live with 3 to 5% of the market, or you put out materials that look like traditional materials, and then you could capture major market share. We might be at this moment where innovative materials that change the way that students learn science can be a major market player. And that is encouraging, because it's what, the three of us lived with for all those years.
That is encouraging. It's got to feel good.
All right, Greenhouse, do you want to go first this time?
So one of the things I read a lot of, things about education every day because I have to do my Twitter, right? And one of the things that is really depressing me is or crushing me, is the whole book banning thing that is going on now. And I feel like we're going back to the dark ages where if let's take these things off the shelves so that kids can't read about it or find out about it. And it's just crushing to me. I feel like we're going back. So that's my crush for the day, because I was reading an article about book banning in Virginia Beach, where I used to live. But what has uplifted me today, in fact, was also in the company that I work with now, we work with school leaders and districts, and we go in and observe their schools and try to help them analyze what is holding teachers back from, instruction, and how could they support them. And we worked with a principal today that it was amazing to see, just from the few times we've met with him, the change that he saw that was needed. Like he came to it himself, just by going through a different type of observation in a classroom and understanding what he should be seeing, and he actually saw it, and it was just exciting. It was like a light went on in his head. So that was a very uplifting moment that our work is actually helping.
Yeah, that's great.
So mine has to do with instructional materials, actually. And I have been asked, informed, voluntold that I'm going to be math department chair at my humble little school next year. And so I was told yesterday, oh, you need to come to this meeting. The middle school has written a memo. They're requesting to adopt new materials. And they're currently using one of those NSF curricula. And so they sent me the paper and I read it. And then I was just crushed, because it was all the reasons that we all heard for why people won't adopt innovative materials. That there's too much reading, and the kids don't have enough skills, and they don't have the prior knowledge. The book assumes too much. All those things. And I was crushed. I'm like, oh, here we go again. But then in the action items, they said the cheery part was, and so they see the better alternative to adopt the illustrative mathematics. And I'm like, all right, well, cool. There you go. I agree. You should do that. So I think it's to your point, though, that it's taken a lot longer. The three of us have dedicated many years of our career to this, and the evolution has taken longer than maybe we wanted, hoped, or prayed. But there is change. Like, I do see the questions, the issues that teachers are asking today are different than the ones that they were asking 20 years ago, when we all first started doing this sort of stuff. So, there is hope.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And Jim's positive shows that as well. So yes, so let's end on that positive note. There is hope, there is change. And, as with anything in education, it's just really, really slow.
Thank you so much for listening. Another brilliant episode. So, of course, this is the part where we do the traditional podcast thing and ask for favors. And leave a rating. If you listen to podcasts, you know this already, but leave a rating, because that helps move us up and helps people looking for education podcasts find us more easily. So thank you all very much, and we will see you next time around.